Metaversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and in this episode of Pop Culture Weapons Analyzed, we'll be looking at the swords from the anime Attack on Titan. Now, the swords are actually part of the vertical maneuvering equipment, and the main controls for this equipment are actually on the sword handles. They have kind of triggers on them. This could affect the way the swords are used, so we might come back to it, but attached to these two controls are blades. And very significant and interesting blades to consider, which is what we're doing in this video. The first thing that you'll notice about these blades is that they're basically box cutters. We call them Stanley knives here in Australia, and they just took a box cutter-like blade and increased its size. Now, if you did that in reality, this would make a very poor sword, but there are certain significant and important, sword characteristics that I think would have been altered to make them more useful. For instance, the width of the blade along its distal plane. So not the flat. If you look at the flat, turn it on the side and look at the width of the blade along that angle, that width is hugely significant in regards to how a sword operates, its mechanics, its feel, its maneuverability. But before we go into that, there's another very interesting element of this sword to consider, and that's the notches that are still present along the blades that are depicted in Attack on Titan, and we also see on box cutters. Now, on box cutters, the point of the blade they're actually cutting with is the very tip, and so if any part of this blade actually becomes blunt, it's going to be the tip, and all the rest is still sharp, which is why the notches are there. Now, you don't use the blade fully extended. You use the blade on a box cutter by only the tip protruding, because if you use it fully extended and you put a lot of pressure on it, because there is an indent, it means the whole blade could snap further down, and you wouldn't want that. And that's exactly what you wouldn't want if you increase the size of them. So if there are indents on Attack on Titan swords, they're actually made to be able to snap the blade. These blades, whenever they are hit with any measure of force along the length of the blade, or even just at the top of it, and they hit something with a lot of resistance causing flex, if these indents are actually made to create break-off points on the blade, they would snap lower down very regularly. This would be a hugely detrimental feature in the design. And even if you didn't want them to snap lower on, okay, if you were to just snap off the top after it gets blunted, you've now reduced the mass and reach of the blade. Reducing the mass will alter how it feels in the hand, how the maneuverability might be even a bit more maneuverable because it'll lower the point of balance, but it also reduces the mass, which means cutting power of the sword, and you don't want to reduce the cutting power of these swords because that is their most important feature. We'll go into what they're meant to do a bit more, but just rounding off this commentary on the notches, they would be hugely detrimental if these notches were actually real on the sword. You would never want that. But what's interesting, I've watched the first 10 or 15 episodes of Attack on Titan, and I never saw anyone snap off the tip. And when researching online, I didn't read any accounts of this happening either. The blades get replaced in whole. So that seems to indicate that these notches along the blade are not there. They're not meant to be there to snap off portions of the blade going down, because it would be absolutely hugely stupid. It would be one of the most dumb, horrible design elements to put on a blade. These are focus in points. They are failure points on the blade, ready made for it to snap into or even lower down at the handle, with any measure of stress. Horrible design feature, which makes me think, let's just say, that's not what they're in there. They're aesthetic kind of things, maybe painted on the top. They're not actual indents in the blade to create focus points of failure. So now we can look at other elements of these blades' design and determine if it's a good design for what it's meant to do. What are they meant to do? Well, they're meant to kill titans, but titans aren't your regular monsters. First of all, titans have really, really tough skin, so much so that regular blades can't cut into them. This is where we come to a bit of a misconception that exists in the world, that harder steels are sharper. Classic example is the katana. People claim that the katana is the sharpest sword in the world. That's completely bonkers, okay? Absolutely incorrect. You can get an iron sword made out of just horrible crappy steel and make it as sharp as a katana. The difference is how long it will retain the edge. And so the idea that katanas are sharper than other swords only means that a katana can hold their edge for longer, but even swords that have a different hardness on the, say, Rockwell hardness scale can retain their edge for quite a significant time, alright? The katana isn't hugely harder than many other good quality steels. But edge retention is an important thing in regards to swords. People don't understand the difference between sharp, really sharp, and insanely sharp. And guess what? There are actually significant differences in how swords perform based on those differences. And people, when they pick a sword, is like, oh yeah, this is good and sharp. It could chop someone's arm off quite well. But that level of sharpness is often completely ineffective as soon as you put in a couple of layers of textile armor protection. And to get through that textile armor, usually linen, you need to go from sharp to insanely sharp. There's a huge difference. There's an interesting thing that happens on the very edge, on the microscopic kind of scale of a sword when you're sharpening the blade. And when you're sharpening the blade, you have different kind of flecks and bits of metal that get jagged off. And so if we're looking at the edge of the blade, it can sometimes look like this. Microscopic, looking at the edge, look like this. And these little kind of flecks of steel are getting hacked off, kind of like a hacksaw on the very edge, okay? And you sharpen it as much as you can, but it's still like this. And so this is kind of the difference between really sharp and insanely sharp, because insanely sharp is when you see these tiny little things on the edge where they smoothen them out and they actually bring it all together like that. When you do that with a sword, and that's usually done with like a special type of leather for kind of smoothing out and doing the final sharpening touches on a blade, the level of sharpness they attain is just insane. They can just slice through bone. When I was a kid, we had a butcher come to our house to slaughter a cow, and he pulled out a knife and just sliced through its hind leg, bone and all, okay? Just like through. So the level of sharpness blades can get is crazy. And interestingly enough, this is the type of sharpness the blades, kind of like paring blades, in Attack on Titan would need to be. Specifically because the skin of the Titans is so tough. Now, cutting into a Titan isn't enough. They actually need to slice out like a V chunk from the back of the neck, the nape of the neck on these Titans to properly kill them. Slicing off an arm, slicing them in half across the waist doesn't do it, all right? Straight out, need to slice this chunk. This is a fatal weak point for these Titans. And having a blade fail on you when you chop into it and getting stuck halfway through, or just sliding along the top and not cutting it, like that, like in the context of the anime, that would be hugely significant. If you had the chance to kill a Titan and you weren't able to do it because your blades weren't sharp enough, it could go on to kill several lives, okay, people, before you're able to actually get a blade sharp enough. So for this purpose, they carry backup blades, full replacement blades that are at the right level of sharpness because their blades dull very quickly. This is very significant for a number of reasons, because the swords in Attack on Titan aren't made out of regular steel, not even hardened steel. According to the anime lore, they're made out of a thing called ultra-hardened steel. We're not given any of the mechanical properties of this steel, only that it's ultra-hardened, and I will have to infer what I can from it, but some of the things I'm inferring are kind of significant. And if these ultra-hardened blades are getting blunted on these Titans, that means any other sword made of any other type of steel would probably be useless. Or even the swords that you can get to that level of sharpness after one slice on a Titan would probably be useless with how quickly these ultra-hardened swords are getting blunted. Well, that means a regular sword would seem to get blunted almost instantly. After one cut, useless. So we can assume this ultra-hardened steel doesn't enable a sword to be sharper than the other swords. It can just retain the edge for longer than a regular sword, which is of course very significant. The other thing that's going to be very important to help out this sword in its cutting capacity is its design. And one of the biggest qualities in sword design that affects cutting is the width of the blade. Now, if we just took a box cutter and increased its size to the size of a real sword, its width would be something around 4 mil, and it would be insanely heavy and it would be horrible at cutting as a result. Don't get me wrong, weight actually makes a sword better at cutting, but its handling properties are very difficult. You need a sword to fall within a manageable, functional weight category to be usable. Unless you're a superhuman, but the characters in Attack on Titan, for most intents and purposes, aren't actually superhuman, except for general anime levels of action fighting and stuff. There are ways for swords to overcome having a particularly thick blade so they can still be good at cutting. Again, a good example is the katana. This katana here is about 4 mil thick from the base to the tip. Very little distal taper, which means the general reduction of the width of the blade, not along this plane, but along this plane, towards the tip. There's basically no distal taper on the average katana, including the one I'm holding. The way it overcomes this problem is by being a bit top heavy, which means there's still a lot of force behind the cut, which helps force apart material, because the thicker the blade, the more the material needs to be pushed apart to actually slice the blade through, because blades are essentially wedges, okay? The thicker the blade and the more resistive the material, the harder it is for it to cut through. So the other way the katana overcomes this is by having a wide edge angle. So if you're looking at this blade here, you'll see it has a fuller, and then from the fuller, there's almost 2.5 centimeters from the fuller to the edge of the blade. So we'll hear the edge of the blade, from the fuller right here to the edge of the blade. About 2.5 to 3 centimeters. That is actually quite a wide distance for this edge bevel. Contrast that with a European one-handed sword. This blade is broader, wider than the katana, yet the edge bevels are shorter because it's double-edged. So if you have a look at this, look at the fuller, and from the end of the fuller to the actual edge of the blade, it's about 1.5 centimeters. That is actually quite less than the katana. So the katana is a thinner blade, but broader along the edge bevel, and the European one-handed arming sword is a broader blade, but thinner along the edge bevel. The way that the European arming sword needs to overcome the problem of having such a thin edge bevel is by making it thinner along the distal plane and having a distal taper at the tip. It doesn't appear that these box cutter-like blades have a proper distal taper. It's hard to actually see and get confirmation on this, because animation is inconsistent with how these swords are depicted, just let alone the width along the actual broad, because sometimes these box cutter blades look much thinner and much wider, and then the actual specific accuracy of how wide the blades are along their proper distal, plane, we can't get any accurate measurements from the anime because of that, and there's nothing written officially. If I was to give my opinion, it looks like these blades have no proper distal taper, and because the edge bevel is so short, like look at the width of the blade, how much of that blade is flat and how much of that blade is angled towards the edge. It's only the very small cutting portion. If this blade was 4 mil thick and it had such a small edge bevel, similar to the length we see on the European arming sword, so this is again like 1.5 centimeters, if this sword was like 4 mil thick along its full length and having this edge bevel, it would have such a poor effect on the cutting capacity. Remember, an edge angle like this cuts very differently to an edge angle like that. Hugely different, and depending on the width of the blade will affect on how big that edge angle is. So just by analyzing these swords based on general sword operating mechanics and how thin that edge bevel is on the end, for effective cutting you would want these swords to be about 1 mil thick. 2 mil at the most. I actually feel 2 millimeters width would make the sword way too heavy with how broad these swords are. 2 mil width and their length, they would still be operable, okay? But because these swords need to be so good at cutting, I reckon 1 mil even better. If a sword was actually only 1 mil thick, it would be so weak and it would be prone to bending like you wouldn't believe. The way you make swords rigid is by making them thick. The katana wants to be as rigid as possible. Big reason is because of the differential hardening in the traditional way it's made. When they bend, they stay bent, okay? They don't flex back. There are modern katanas made out of spring steel, but that's not how they were traditionally made. And so to overcome the weakness that they have when they bend is that they made them really thick. Another reason why they're thick. And they get the advantage of it being heavier in the cut and just being like a portable guillotine. The katana has an interesting marriage of certain sword qualities that give it the properties that it has. And it's a beautiful sword design, by the way. Like, this katana has certain weaknesses that I openly acknowledge, but that doesn't mean it isn't a beautiful, great sword, really good at what it's meant to do. Basically, if you're going out fighting zombies, or even titans for that matter, the katana is actually a pretty good pick. But if you're fighting someone else with a sword, there are certain things that really, limit its overall effectiveness in comparison to other swords. Lack of a crossguard is a big thing, and their lack of reach. It's a shorter sword in compared to other swords for being two-handed. This arming sword that I've been comparing is the same length as the katana, an average katana, by the way. Tashis are different, I know. But this is a one-handed sword, same blade length, okay? And so when it comes to reach, the katana falls short, unfortunately. So the swords in Attack on Titan, if they are as thin as you would want them to be effective at cutting, they would be so weak on flex and break, snap very easily. But they kind of already do that. And the other interesting thing to consider is the ultra-hardened steel. What if these blades actually get their rigidity from the material that they're made of? This is technically a fictional material that is ultra-hard. If something is ultra-hard, that means it's going to be resistant to flexing already. If it's hit with enough force to overcome its internal strength, and it being very hard, it would break or shatter, which is how the swords actually break in Attack on Titan. They break, they don't bend. They don't bend like that. They're not soft, they're hard, ultra hard. So perhaps this is the answer. The swords are 1 mil thick, which would just make them devastatingly effective at cutting, being so thin. They would need to push apart such little material. Again, so thin, right? Yet they could be rigid enough for functional use because of what they're made out of. This special ultra-hard steel. I think that would be the answer. What's really interesting, we've only been talking about the width of the blade. There are other interesting elements to consider. One of the things to consider is the blade is a straight blade. There's no curve, there's no even curve to the tip. It's like a longer version of a butcher's cleaver almost. There is nothing wrong with having a straight blade. In fact, there are many straight blades historically. Case in point. But the interesting thing about arming sword like this, or many straight bladed swords, they're not perfectly straight. I mean, if you actually have a look at the blade, it's first coming in on an angular reduction compared to the other part of the blade and the direction of the hilt. So it's already angling down, but then as you get closer to the tip, it is curving in towards the tip. So even a straight blade like this has a measure of curve in it. The Attack on Titan swords, the blade has no curve at all. It is completely straight. You could kind of say it has a tip, okay, because it cuts off at an angle, but there's no blade on that angle, okay? If you actually hit someone on the flat part of that blade, it wouldn't cut unless you got them right on the tip where the point is, so you could still perform a thrust in that way. But essentially there is no blade on the tip, there's only a point. That makes perfect sense. These swords aren't meant to pierce at all. You can't kill a Titan by poking it, you have to cut. After thinking about it, I had to say I like the design because there are interesting pros and cons from having a straight blade versus a curved blade or even an inverse curve. Now I go into far more detail in this when I review the Sakabato from Rurouni Kenshin. I have a video, check it out. Just briefly paraphrasing, a small curve like this doesn't assist in cutting. That's a misconception. But a small curve like this can help in edge alignment, making it easier to cut with. So if I put the blade like this on my hand and just let it rolls into correct edge alignment. It's auto-correcting for that feature. In opposite to this, if I reverse it and have an inverse curve, if I put it like that, it wants to roll out of edge alignment. And so if you're hitting something like that and hit something hard, it wants to roll it. That's bad, that's really bad. But if you're hitting something like this, it wants to roll into edge alignment. Another reason why the katana is so easy to cut with. What's interesting though, the inverse curve increases the leverage point from the way that you're holding the sword. Again, I go into more detail in my Sakabato Rurouni Kenshin video. What Attack on Titan's design does, instead of having a proper inverse curve, which means it wants to roll out of correct edge alignment, is completely straight, which basically enhances the leverage you can get in the cut as much as possible without giving detrimental effects to edge alignment. So I actually like the design. It's clever in that way, and the leverage would increase cutting capacity. An important question to consider is how well trained the soldiers are. We do see them getting trained in Attack on Titan, and they go through a lengthy enough process, but is that enough to become master swordsmen? Well, in the field they get a lot more practice and they could become masters eventually, but not necessarily from the training. And the question that comes to my mind is, would the people organizing this military want to give their soldiers swords that were easier to use and give them a higher chance of cutting these Titans, killing them? Their blades, as designed, would give a bit more leverage, a bit more leverage than the straight arming sword, and more leverage than the katana, but there would be no, help in edge alignment. So basically, if they did a cut at a good angle, the cut would be more devastating because there is no curve whatsoever on the thing. But as soon as that edge angle is off, there is higher chance that their cut would perform poorly, maybe even bounce off. Their swords are really rigid. That would certainly help, but having a slight curve like the katana has, if your cut is off on the angle, it's not straight, it's off, the slight curve wants to push it correct, okay? Which means it could save your bad cut and turn it into a good cut, and you could still kill the Titan. So this is, it's a bit of give and take. If the soldiers are properly trained, they wouldn't need any help with their edge alignment, so they wouldn't need the curve. But if these are raw recruits being thrown in, well, having a slight curve might help them out. And if it's a life and death situation, every small bit of assistance could end up being very significant in the long run. The next thing I want to talk about is the handle. Now, the handle looks a little bulky, all right, but these aren't swords made for dueling one-on-one with another swordsman, okay? The main cut is just these big sweeping slashes, okay? So because of that, I'm a bit more reluctant to be overly critical of the bulkiness of the handguard because it's there out of necessity. These are the operating levers for the vertical maneuvering equipment. The thing that I will be a bit critical of is that the triggers, okay, are encased with actual rings around each finger. Now, there's nothing wrong with a proper handguard. Handguards have been on swords, you know, historically already, and the large kind of lever is like a handguard already, so that's fine. But the actual ring holes for the two top fingers could be very detrimental. If you hit something on a bad angle, and it's so much so that it gets twisted out of your grasp, your fingers could get caught in the rings, twisted, and they could break quite easily if they don't get pulled out of those rings quick enough, and that's a detrimental feature in the design. I don't see why there's any functional reason for them to be there. I don't think there's even a need. I mean, there are guards on triggers, like for instance guns. Guns have a guard around the trigger. That's a protective measure, so if the gun gets dropped on something, it won't hit the trigger and cause the gun to go off. There's a guard protecting that there. I don't think that is nearly as problematic or dangerous for the vertical maneuvering equipment because they actually already have kind of a large guard lever above them. Another confusing thing about this sword, remember, if those notches are there for the things to be snapped off, that's a huge, just absolute stupid thing to have in the design, but because they never snap off like that in the anime, let's pretend that they're aesthetic. So if they're aesthetic, that means the angle of the tip of the sword doesn't need to be on a sharp angle like that, okay? It can be flat. And if it can be flat, there is no reason why this blade needs to be single-edged. The length or width of the edge doesn't cross the halfway mark. On a katana, it does. Remember, the edge starts here on the katana, passes the halfway mark, and sits on the back end of the blade, giving us a much nicer, longer edge bevel, which assists in cutting. If you put a secondary edge on the back of the katana, only on the distance it has remaining, which is where the fuller is on mine, the angle of the edge would be much wider, and it would have such worse cutting capacity on the back edge, so it's kind of detrimental. Also, it would take away weight, and the katana has a good kind of weight balance for its size, for what it needs to do. It is heavier for its size, but it actually gets a benefit from that in its cutting. But on these box cutter-like swords, they could put a back edge on them and have no real detrimental effects on the sword's function. And the advantage you get about this is back edge cuts. They do these big kind of slashing attacks in Attack on Titan, but you could do backwards cuts, all like, I'm not outside, so it's hard to demonstrate, but even when you're going around and you do a back cut like that with the back edge, I mean, if you're on a particular angle and you're spinning past and you need to do a cut with the back edge, that could be the way that you kill the Titan, and it just increases the versatility. And because there's no detrimental effect by putting a back edge on these swords, they really should have a back edge, in my opinion. There is really no reason for them not to. So that is a flaw in its design, in my opinion. So there we go. These have been my thoughts and analysis of these swords from Attack on Titan. And as we have found out, there are some strong, you know, interesting elements that work really well. And there are also some baffling, weird, and useless parts as well when you look at it from the perspective of functional sword design. Thank you for watching. Please share your thoughts in the comment section below. I'd love to read them. And of course, I look forward to seeing you again. So until that time, farewell.